Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 35 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to break down the two big wide receiver trades that went down this past week and talk about some veteran buy candidates for those of you with contending Dynasty teams. Before we do, I just want to remind everyone, as always, make sure you're following the show on whatever platform you're currently listening to the podcast on. We're on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, whatever your preferred platform of choice is, we are there. So go give us a follow, leave us a 5-star review, and go find us on Twitter or X at Dynasty War Room. You can find us on Facebook as well. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to help us grow there. So it's been a couple of weeks, had a little vacation, and then things got crazy with work in real life, which of course is just an unfortunate fact of life. And so we're back. It's been a couple of weeks. We've had some interesting things go down. It's essentially been a whole bunch of injuries outside of these recent trades. It's just been, player after player, coming down with some sort of injury, whether it be Nico Collins, Jonathan Taylor, just this week with Rashid Shaheed from the New Orleans Saints going down. They, of course, are playing tonight against the Broncos. I'm recording this on Thursday, October 17th. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind. So let's just jump right into this. You guys know the deal at this point. We're going to just talk about our wide receivers that got moved. Davante Adams to the New York Jets, Amari Cooper to the Buffalo Bills. Then I'm going to touch on some important waiver pickups and why some of these trades for, third and fourth round picks can really help some of you contending teams, especially those of you that have been hit by injuries. And then, of course, we will dive into our veteran buy candidates. I have 10 players, 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 3 receivers, and 2 tight ends that I think all would qualify as veteran players that are worthwhile targets that won't cost you an arm and a leg in a trade. So, kicking things off, Davante Adams, there have been rumors for weeks about, whether he'd be traded. And of course, the New York Jets with his boy Aaron Rodgers has been the obvious and likely destination. And so that is, of course, what happened. He is in New York, went for a conditional third-round pick, which can turn into a second. I don't think that those conditions will be met. I think Adams has to be first or second team All-Pro, or the Jets have to make a Super Bowl or a conference final, and I don't think either one of those things will be happening this year. So just something to keep in mind if you're curious about, kind of how the trade compensation works in those deals. But age 32, he obviously has the connection with Aaron Rodgers, and he goes there, Garrett Wilson, Mike Williams, Alan Lazard. It's a slightly crowded room, although, some of those players less relevant than others. But this is bad news for Garrett Wilson. There's no other way to spin it. If you're a Garrett Wilson manager, this is bad news because, make no mistake about it, Davante Adams will be and is the number 1 wide receiver in New York. Rodgers is going to throw him the ball. That's, the whole point of this trade for Davante Adams was to reunite with his quarterback. And, Garrett Wilson has, been okay. He's had some decent weeks. He's gotten a lot of volume recently after a bit of a slow start. And just to remind you all, I did pick Garrett Wilson as my fantasy bust for the year, given the fact that he was going in the first round of redraft startups, or excuse me, not startups, redraft drafts. There we go. Redraft drafts. Kind of a funny phrase to say there, but Garrett Wilson is going to take a step back. He probably won't be seeing this type of target volume that he's used to. However, this maybe is a good thing for his long-term development. I guess that could be the angle there is, he's facing the cornerback 2 now instead of the top guy. There's going to be a lot of attention on Rodgers. So there is something there for Wilson to make the best of the situation. But in terms of Adams, he's going to step in right away. His hamstring, of course, is magically healed and ready to go. And I expect him to jump right in and, get off to a hot start. However, he does have a tough defensive matchup in the first week against Pittsburgh. They've got a great defense. And in terms of fantasy value, if you are if you're a rebuilding team or a middle of the pack team that doesn't look like you're, going to be able to do a whole lot this season, obviously now is the time to sell, because I think now is probably his point of highest value for the rest of his career. That could spike a little bit if he were to have some huge game in the next couple weeks. But generally speaking, the hype is there right now. If you're a rebuilding team, you should be moving on from Davante Adams. Ask for a lot. You might not get it, but I think that there will be some leagues where you can get a first-round pick for him. I don't know that I would move a first-round pick for Davante Adams as a contender. I don't know that I trust either him or Aaron Rodgers and that Jets offense just in general. It's just been a relatively bad offense. Rodgers is not the same. Now, in fairness, I do think that Davante Adams does represent, a veteran by target. He could fit into some of the players that we're going to talk about later, where, depending on your situation, you might be able to get him for a second-round pick plus a player or, a couple later picks and avoid having to give up the first. That's going to be league dependent depending on the situation of the Adams manager, but certainly worth poking around because I do expect him to get some pretty good target volume in that offense. And of course, if you've listened to the show for a while now, I was a fan of Davante Adams in the offseason. I thought he was in a good situation with the Raiders to just get peppered with a boatload of targets. Obviously, the hamstring and then the quarterback play, which has been probably a little bit worse than expected, and the maybe quicker than expected emergence of Brock Bowers has all played a role in his sort of disappointment to start the year. But we'll see how that changes in New York, where Garrett Wilson is really the only other player that he needs to worry about for targets. Now, Amari Cooper was the other big-name receiver to be moved this past week. He goes from Cleveland to Buffalo. Excuse me. And that is a huge upgrade for both Amari Cooper and Buffalo. Buffalo has needed that boundary wide receiver. Keon Coleman is simply not ready for that role yet. So Amari Cooper will slide into that spot. He was in a dreadful situation with Cleveland. Deshaun Watson has been bad, as predicted as well. And, Amari Cooper was somebody that was a hard sell for me leading into the season. And I think we've seen why, given how bad he was in Cleveland and just that Cleveland offense in general. But I am a little bit hesitant to all of a sudden jump all the way back in on Amari Cooper. I certainly think he will be better than he was in Cleveland. This is something that definitely helps Josh Allen and, helps this offense in real life. I think it's probably a better real life move than a fantasy move. He's on an expiring contract. He is 30 years old. And he was traded for a 3rd and 7th round pick. And then the Bills also received a 6th back in that trade. So this is a little bit different than the Adams deal, where Cooper is probably going to take a couple weeks to kind of get up to speed. He doesn't have that chemistry already with Allen. It's a new offense, something that will certainly take some time to, develop. But I do think that there's a pretty good role here for him. This is unfortunate news for my guy, Khalil Shakir, who has been the number 1 receiver on this team. I think that Shakir falls down to a number 2 spot, which honestly is probably better fit for his skill set. He's really more of a second option in the passing game. So I still have high expectations for Shakir this season. This isn't something where I'm suddenly going to keep him on the bench. If you need to play him, I think he's still perfectly fine to play, assuming he's healthy. I think he had that ankle injury and whatnot, but I think this is something that could open up the offense a bit too. He's something in between Gabe Davis and Stephon Diggs of last year. I don't think he's necessarily going to be Stephon Diggs. I think that I just don't think he has that type of talent anymore. But he certainly could be a better version of Gabe Davis, that field stretcher, somebody that can get a deep ball and be kind of a go-to target for Josh Allen in those critical situations. So certainly a startable player, somebody that I think will be in the top 36. I don't know that he's not a wide receiver 1, and I think he's maybe a borderline wide receiver 2. I think something in that, around the end of wide receiver 2, like 24, 25, is a pretty good spot for him in terms of rest of season output. I'm not expecting him to, do anything too crazy, but given that, now is a great time to sell Amari Cooper, especially if you are a middle of the pack or rebuilding team. So if you listened to my advice in the offseason, you would have unloaded him already if you were in this situation. But now if you held on, this is another opportunity where his value is going to spike because people are so excited about him being in Buffalo. Now, his situation is better, absolutely. And that's why you're going to be able to get a whole lot more right now than you would have, a week or two ago for Amari Cooper. If you're a contender, I would absolutely not be trading a first-round pick for Amari Cooper, but I do think if you have a late second or, there's a situation, I don't know that you're going to have to pay more than a second, to be honest. I think the temptation is going to be there, which is why if you're, rebuilding or middle of the pack, moving on from Cooper right now could be a really good situation for you because I think there is going to be this tendency to want to overpay on the part of contending teams. So see what the market is in your own league. Every league will be a little bit different, but if you are a contender and you want to take a shot with the late 2, I think you certainly could do that. I personally probably won't be going after Amari Cooper just because I am a little bit worried about the age and the fact that his production had already taken kind of a decline. But again, sometimes you don't really have the option of being super picky if half your team is injured or you have a couple starters that have, been knocked out, or, maybe you had a Tyreek Hill, Nico Collins, as you're starting 2 receivers, and Tyreek Hill lost his quarterback and Nico Collins is on IR, and, you need to add somebody to, fill a role for, the rest of the season, or at least certainly for the next, month or so. Somebody like Cooper could be a good fit for your team if you're in that type of situation. Now, given all the injuries, we've talked about, just there's a laundry list of players that have, hit IR, been, knocked out for a week or two at a time, whether it be Malik Neighbors with a concussion, who's going to be back this week. We mentioned all sorts of players. Chris Olave was out. So it's been a tough go. Puka Nacua is still out with his knee injury. Cooper Kupp out as well, although he should be coming back soon. So there's been a lot of big name receivers. The Eagles wideouts have had concussion and other injury issues. So, the importance of depth has really been, highlighted so far this season. And I want to point out that at this point in the year, if you're a contender, it's been a couple weeks since we had an episode, but on that last show where we went in depth on how to tell if you should rebuild and how to go about that process, we are in the point of the season where, you should have a good idea of whether you are a contender or a rebuilder. And if you're not a contender, you pretty much are de facto a rebuilder, or at least in the sense of you should be retooling to focus on next season, even if you aren't, jumping into a full tilt rebuild where you're selling everything. You should be moving on from older veterans and things like that. If you're clearly not going to be a playoff contender. So if you are one of these teams that you've had a good season, you're in the top, 6, top 4 of your league, maybe you're contending for a bye week, especially, I think is when these types of moves are good. Pay really close attention to the waiver wire and make good use of your 3rd and 4th round picks. You don't need to hang on to those draft picks. I think this is a really good time of year where you can acquire startable players, even if they only start for you for a week or 2 overall, or you just have them as, a handcuff or injury depth. We've seen players get hurt. Look at James Cook at the last second the other night. I was in a league where I was in a close race, and I had James Cook and Josh Allen in my lineup. I needed a bunch of points, and I went out and I sent a 2026 4th round pick for Ty Johnson. Did it feel good? No, not really. It didn't really pan out either. However, the process was there, right? Obviously, it was Ray Davis that ended up being the far more productive running back. Now, he would have cost more to me. However, the same general process applies. Sometimes you just have to make a move, and it did work out for me. I was able to pick up a win in that league with that, at least beating the league median. So it was an important move for my team, even though it didn't feel great at the time. And there are moves like that out there. You can look at the Bills situation, look at the Colts, Trey Sermon, Tyler Goodson. You'd probably be able to get either one for a 4th round pick. Certainly Goodson, probably you could even go with a cheap player. But if Taylor's out, if Sermon's out, and you need to trade a 4th for Goodson to get a spot start for a week, Trey Sermon, you need a 4th round pick or a 3rd round pick for, that depth if you're a Jonathan Taylor manager. Sean Tucker came out of nowhere and had a big week. You probably could have picked him up on waivers a couple weeks ago or gotten him for a 4th round pick. Probably not anymore. I'll bet that price has absolutely skyrocketed. Same with guys like Tank Bigsby. Tyrone Tracy was a rookie that people were excited about. He got his shot and played very well. You probably could have had him for a 3rd round pick before the Singletary injury. Tank Bigsby, somebody that has had a bit of run. And then just looking at some of the other positions too, because of course, running back is where this is really, really valuable because of the injury, just the nature of the position and guys getting banged up all the time. But Bub Means, rookie for the New Orleans Saints, is going to get a lot of playing time at wide receiver tonight. Andy Dalton, taking over for Bryce Young, is somebody that you could probably get for a 3rd or 4th round pick if you are in need of a quarterback. I just sent a 2026 3rd round pick for Andy Dalton in a league where I was very desperate for a quarterback. I had Stafford on a bye. I had Anthony Richardson ruled out at the last minute. And, I needed a QB. So I was the Bryce Young manager. And so I figured it made sense for me to go out and pair up Dalton with Young. Helped me out there. And those types of moves are things that you can only make if you're paying close attention to your league. So, waivers. There's not going to be a ton of big name, obvious starters on waivers. But if you have roster space in Dynasty to comb through, look through some depth charts and find players, 3rd string running backs should, generally speaking, especially if you roster the starter, go pick one of those guys up. They're one injury away from having relevance. Goodson and Tucker and Johnson, these are all examples of this. And see what you can find. Maybe there is a receiver that, hey, you see the path with an injury or two away. High-profile backup quarterbacks, things like that. This is the time of year to go make those moves and set up yourself for success down the line so you're not emptying your entire fab, bankroll on one of these players, once they become needed. Better to just cycle through and fill up your roster with players that could present actual starting value for you. Now is the time to let guys go, like KJ Osborne. I dumped him in a whole bunch of leagues this past week, which was kind of a tough thing because look, he was one of these guys last year, right? Justin Jefferson goes down, all of a sudden he has value. He's getting traded for 2nd or 3rd round picks, and now he's essentially worthless because he ended up in a bad offense where he doesn't consistently see the field, and you move on. It's just what you have to do. So keep those final few spots on your bench, fresh and rotating all the time. That way you can hopefully luck into, either somebody worth value in a trade or somebody that you can start should you need to. All right. So moving on to sort of the main segment of the episode is veteran buy candidates. So this time of year, as we've talked about at great length, you should know where you stand within your league at this point. If you are 0-6, 1-5, 2-4, it's important to pair that with where you are in terms of points for. See where your scoring is, because there are certainly going to be teams that might be 1-5, 2-4 that are 1st or 2nd in their league in scoring. I have a league where I am 2-4 and I lead the league by a very large margin in points for. It's unfortunate. I think that I still should make the playoffs. It's, a situation where, look, your luck should correct eventually. So I'm not necessarily punting there, but if you're a 1-5 team and you're, in the bottom 3 in points for, where you stand. If you're racking up a ton of injuries and whatever, you know where you are. So this is for teams that are going to make the playoffs or are right there. They want to make a playoff push without breaking the bank. Or if you're a contender that's just looking to push yourself over the edge, some of these players might be for you. And so let's start it off at quarterback. And just to preface this, none of these players are going to be rookies or young players. Like I said, I want these to be veteran players, that are a little bit up there in age, because that's going to bring their cost down. Just inherently a part of Dynasty, these younger players are going to be, commanding more draft capital and trades, better players going back. But sometimes, especially if you're a rebuilding team, and particularly if you're in a rebuilding team that goes by max points 4 to set your draft order, these rebuilding teams are trying to get points off the roster. So, somebody that won't be important to them next year or the year after, they're going to try to move on from now to improve their odds for an earlier first-round pick, and it helps you as a contender. You can get a nice little deal for some of these players. So, quarterback. First one on the list, Kirk Cousins, quarterback of the Atlanta Falcons. He's QB 24 on Keep Trade Cut, and he had a pretty slow start to the season, but he's picked it up since. Had that huge monster game a couple weeks ago, and he's shown very good chemistry lately, especially with Drake London, but with Darnell Mooney as well. The running game has been, producing, although not necessarily the way that we hoped in terms of being a huge Bijan Robinson, backfield that's been a little bit more split. However, Kirk Cousins, a very stable, steady quarterback, that can be a QB2 for you. He can fill in on bye weeks if you need somebody to, be more of a depth option and you don't have to start him every week. He's a very good option. And I think what makes Kirk Cousins especially interesting is he has a very favorable playoff schedule. So he has the Raiders, the Giants, and the Commanders in weeks 15, 16, and 17. So if you make it that far or you have an injury, whatever your situation is, this is somebody that you can absolutely start with confidence in those 3 games in the playoffs. And given the fact that you probably won't have to pay more than a late second, I think Kirk Cousins is somebody that you can absolutely go after if you are a contender. Next up on the list is Baker Mayfield, quarterback of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, QB 15 on Keep Trade Cut, and he has been steadily rising throughout the season. He's QB2 overall in scoring, and he probably won't finish there, but he doesn't have that bad of a schedule. He gets Dallas and Carolina in week 16 and 17, which are right there in the semifinals and finals of the fantasy playoffs. So definitely a much improved passing offense. He's been very good, and he's got elite weapons. Chris Godwin has been outstanding. He's got Mike Evans, who's, still a big red zone threat. The running game, while it's not Rachaad White on his own anymore, it's a bit more of a committee. This is an offense that can move the ball. So you probably will, you're going to have to pay more for Mayfield than you would for Cousins. But because of his past and sort of the up and down nature, I don't know that you're going to have to pay as much for Baker Mayfield as you maybe would with somebody who has been a little bit more consistent in their career. And I think that's great news for contenders, because I think you can get him for probably just a late first, or late first and a couple later picks, or some rookies, or players that are kind of haven't produced much but still have some hope or promise for the future that would help a rebuilding team. I think a move like that would make some sense, and you're not going to have to pay multiple first round picks or anything like that for Baker Mayfield. So certainly something to explore if you are in need of a quarterback. All right, so running backs. I have 3 names here, and I went back and forth because there's actually a number of different players that I think you could pick. And given the first player's evaluation in terms of where he, his value on Keep Trade Cut, I was a little bit nervous about putting him on this list because I'm a little bit scared. But I think that's just how running backs are, right? The running back landscape changes so much. It's so year to year that, that's just the nature of the beast. So David Montgomery, the first name up, running back for the Detroit Lions. He is running back 13 on Keep Trade Cut. And Montgomery is not a flashy option. He's never going to be that. He's not viewed in the fantasy community as the number 1 running back in Detroit, because from that perspective, it's Jahmyr Gibbs, who's also had a great season. But it's because of those things that you might be able to get a pretty good deal here on somebody like Montgomery. If Montgomery had the same exact stats but didn't share backfield with somebody like Jahmyr Gibbs, he would be worth, I think, significantly more in the eyes of fantasy managers. He's been very good. He just got a contract extension, so he's staying in Detroit for the next several years. And you don't need to trade a first for David Montgomery. I think you can get him for a 2. Maybe it'll take a later pick or a player or something along those lines with that second round pick, but you're not going to have to give up the farm for David Montgomery. Now, if you're going to give up the farm for any running back, now this isn't somebody on my list here because, again, I'm trying to find guys that aren't going to completely break your bank. But if you truly want to go that route, I think the running back veteran that makes the most sense to give up a first round pick for is Saquon Barkley. I've been in on him all season. Before the season, he was my runner-up for fantasy MVP, and he's been very good. He's got a pretty nice schedule. So if you're going to go that route, that's who I would be trading a first for. You're probably going to have to do more than a first with that. Probably a nice, solid package, but that could be a player worth it. But in terms of players that are not going to cost you a first, next up on this list is J.K. Dobbins, running back for the LA Chargers. He's running back 26 on Keep Trade Cut. He's past his bye week, as is Montgomery, which are, both very nice things for fantasy, so you don't have to worry about that. He's got the Bucs, the Broncos, and the Patriots in the playoffs. So pretty good schedule there for running backs. Gus Edwards is on IR. We don't know when he will be back. And the Chargers are going to run the ball no matter what. That's what they do. Jim Harbaugh's there. That is his entire philosophy. It is infuriating as a Justin Herbert manager in multiple leagues. However, that is the nature of what the Chargers do and what Harbaugh does. So, the Chargers are also having a little bit more success in the win column than, maybe people expected. So, if you're winning, it's hard to knock the strategy. But J.K. Dobbins, the big question for him is simply injury. He's had multiple injuries in his past, serious injuries, and he has looked pretty good. He's been a very good running back for fantasy, and I think people are still a little bit skeptical of his situation, so I don't think you're going to have to give up a lot for him. A late second-round pick probably gets it done, maybe multiple thirds, with a player. What players cost really just comes down to the individual managers and how your league is set up and where the manager is that has somebody like Dobbins on their team. But regardless, this is not somebody you're going to have to part with a first for, and there's a lot of things in his favor. He's got a good matchup this week against Arizona. So J.K. Dobbins, the second running back on this list. Now, the third running back is going to be James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals, running back 29. He's somebody that I've brought up a lot on this show because I just think that he is continuously undervalued. I mean, people were all hot and bothered for Trey Benson in the offseason. He's been terrible, and this is clearly James Conner's backfield still, and I think this is a really good buy low opportunity because he had a poor output last week. He was a little bit banged up with an ankle injury, but it does look like he practiced in full today's, and I think he's going to be playing this week, so he should be fine. Now, if you want to wait to try to acquire him, and again, similar price, I think, to J.K. Dobbins, probably a late second gets this done. Maybe a third and a player or something like that. Whatever you can do to make this work. Again, not going to break the bank, no first-round picks, but this could be a situation where you maybe wait until after his game against the Chargers because they do have a very good defense. So, this is something where you probably already are going to get a little bit of a discount. You could maybe get an even larger discount, but it's up to you, depending on what you need. If you want to start him this weekend, if you can afford to wait, I think you just have to understand that he's probably not going to have a huge game this weekend. But in terms of long-term, he has the Patriots, the Panthers, and the Rams in the playoffs, not to mention two matchups still to go with Seattle, who have been pretty suspect against the run this year. So it's a good situation for James Conner, and he's somebody that I have on a bunch of teams. I have tried to acquire him in a few others, so I think this is a good time to buy. And he does not have a contract for next season. So I think there's some fears there. That's certainly something you can bring up in your negotiations. Hey, he might be toast. He might end up being a backup somewhere. But I do believe that there's a pretty good chance that he re-signs with Arizona, particularly with how poorly Trey Benson has played, and the fact that he's not even the clear number 2 in Arizona. So, if you're able to get a second year out of James Conner in addition to the rest of the season, I think that would be just really good value for you in what is still, an above average offense. All right, so moving on over to wide receiver. Now, Chris Godwin is going to be the first name on the list, wide receiver 25 on Keep Trade Cut. And we talked a bit about Tampa's offense with Baker Mayfield, and Godwin has been a huge part of, this offense succeeding and Baker having a really good season. And he's a very talented player, right? Chris Godwin has been, for a long time, a very good, consistent, wide receiver 2 in fantasy. And he's been insane. He's been a wide receiver 1. He's had a huge resurgence. He's 28 years old, though, so I think that's going to help keep his price tag down. And I think he's priced pretty appropriately, wide receiver 25. I think it's something right on the border of a first and second round pick. Again, this will be league dependent, but I do think that there will be ways to get a deal done without giving up a first, whether it's a second and a third or 2 seconds or a second and a decent player, but somebody that's probably on your bench. There are going to be ways to try to get something done where you don't have to give up the farm because of his age. So Chris Godwin, I expect, this streak of excellence to continue. Now, I don't know that he's going to finish as a top 5 wide receiver necessarily, but I think he certainly should finish as a wide receiver 1 this year. And, I don't expect the fall off to be anything to the point where you can't start him every single week. So, Chris Godwin, absolutely somebody that would go target. Maybe if you can create yourself a nice little stack with Baker Mayfield, I think that's a really nice combo to have, as we've already seen those two have been really, really good. So Chris Godwin, the first wide receiver on this list of veteran buys. Number 2 is going to be Tyreek Hill, and he is Miami Dolphins wide receiver 20 on Keep Trade Cut. And this is an interesting situation because he's getting up there in age, right? He's at 30 years old, but he's got a rough quarterback situation right now with Tua out because of the concussions. However, it seems like Tua is going to return in the next couple weeks. Probably not this week, but I think there is some hope for the following game against Arizona, which would be a great defense for Tua to return against. But regardless of when that actually happens, whether it's 2 weeks from now, 3 or 4 weeks from now, he should return at some point this season with plenty of time to go before your fantasy playoffs. So if you are a true contender, particularly if you're in the top 3 and you're pushing for one of those buys, this is a player that can really change the outlook of your team if Tua comes back. You're almost for sure going to need to trade your first round pick to get this done. But again, if you're a contending team and you're projected to be somewhere in that 10 to 12 range of picks, I think that giving that up for Tyreek Hill will end up worth it for you because he is truly one of the best wide receivers in the league. And when he has, adequate quarterback play, he's going to get fed the ball. It's been a disappointing few weeks, which I think, will encourage managers to sell, especially if, they are now struggling because of Tyreek Hill's lack of production. So check it out, explore the situation. I just saw him get traded for, I think it was a first and a third in a league of mine. So situations are out there where you can get a deal done. All right. Now, the last wide receiver on this list, I thought hard about this because I don't know that you can really trust this player in your lineup right now. But if you need a starter, you need somebody to plug in, you've had a lot of injuries, or you simply want to buy somebody low that you think can bounce back a bit as the season goes on, this could be your guy. So Calvin Ridley, wide receiver for the Tennessee Titans, he's wide receiver 66 on Keep Trade Cut, which is extremely low. And he's been awful, right? He's been very bad the past few weeks. He had a bunch of targets, but no catches. He's been in single digits in fantasy points. And so it's been a rough go. He's shown that he's frustrated with the offense and not, getting the ball. And I think that makes this a really good time to try to get him for cheap, because when a player like this, has some sort of outburst where they show that they're frustrated, especially a player like Ridley that just signed a big extension, a big contract there as a free agent. So he's going to be there the next few years. So they want to keep this man happy. So I fully expect him to get a bunch of scripted targets this weekend. So I think that you can acquire him for really, really cheap. I mean, if you were to use Keep Trade Cuts trade calculator, a third and a fourth round pick shows as an overpay, which I don't agree with. But I think that just kind of shows you what the sentiment is right now about Ridley, that he's going to be cheap. I don't think you're going to have to give up anything close to a first. I think that a rebuilding team asking for a second is perfectly fair. I have him in a league, and I think that that's probably what I would be, wanting in return. But you might not get that. You might not have anybody willing to pay for that, given how bad he's been. So, with all that being said, this is your time as a contender. Go make a move, get yourself some depth for a player that has a history of being able to get it done, albeit he is a little bit of a streaky player. So if you know that, you need a guy for bye weeks, somebody to fill in for an injury until someone returns from IR. Calvin Ridley could absolutely be that player for you. And if everything just, burns down and goes terribly, well, you didn't have to give up a lot to get him. So, it's not going to be the end of the world for you. But I think it's worth the risk, if you can get him for a price, similar to what he's listed at on Keep Trade Cut. I think that's a really big steal with, high reward and relatively low risk. He also, before we move on to tight ends, he also has a playoff schedule of the Bengals, Colts, and Jaguars, all three of which have been pretty bad against wide receivers. So given, that playoff schedule, just one more reason why acquiring Calvin Ridley could make sense for you. All right, so let's move on to tight ends. And I have two names here, and we'll start with David Njoku, who's tight end 17. And after the Amari Cooper trade, he is really the new number one target in Cleveland. Now, Jerry Jeudy is still there, and he, will get targets and be a solid player. I think, he'll pick up some of that Amari Cooper, part of the offense. But the tight end landscape has been so bad that David Njoku could essentially be, an upper echelon weekly starter because he's going to get targets, he's going to get catches, so he just needs to stay healthy. But at tight end 17, you're not going to have to pay more than a late second to get him. I think 2/3 could even, get something done depending on what type of team has him in your league if it's a rebuilder. So tight ends, the landscape is just so bad right now outside of those top few guys. So, make a move, poke around. He would not be, and I should say this. David Njoku is not my preferred target for tight end in this range. The next guy I'm going to talk about would by far, I would absolutely prefer Travis Kelce, who is my next player, over David Njoku. I'd also prefer Evan Engram. So there are a couple players that I think I would like more, but Njoku at tight end 17 is being valued so low that I think you can sneak in there before the market maybe corrects itself after the Cooper trade and get a nice little deal done. But Travis Kelce, the final player that I want to talk about, Kansas City Chiefs, he's tight end 11 on Keep Trade Cut, and he's back to being the number one guy in Kansas City. I mean, with Rashee Rice out for the season, Xavier Worthy is somebody that really just needs more manufactured touches still at this point and is a 2 or a 3. And then outside of that, it's Juju Smith-Schuster. Travis Kelce is the receiving game for Kansas City. So given his age, being in the mid-30s and all this, worry about him retiring after the season, which I do think is a legitimate worry. But if he's going to give you 15 to 20 points per game, especially, in tight end premium leagues, I think you can get him for a second and a third. I don't think you're going to have to give up a first-round pick for him because he's, so old, but, in football, old at least. And so whether it's a second and a third, whether it's, 2/3 in a player, again, I just don't think you're going to have to break the bank to acquire him. And maybe you're really in a tough spot and you have to give up a little bit more than you'd like, a second and a more quality player or 2 seconds, and maybe you get a third or fourth in return with Kelce. there are going to be creative ways to get deals done. They don't always have to be just straight pick for player, a second for Kelce type of thing. You can get creative, include some different players, get a larger package going, and figure something out. But Travis Kelce, I fully expect to be a top 5 tight end rest of season, if not top 2 or 3. In fact, I think it's hard to say that anyone else will be tight end 1 rest of season. I think Brock Bowers is probably the only other guy. I think you have Bowers, Kelce, McBride, and then Laporta are really probably the 4 guys that immediately jump to mind as they could be the number 1 tight end rest of season. And I think Kelce would absolutely be firmly in the mix for number 1 for the rest of the season. So whenever you can get a player of that type of quality without having to trade a first-round pick as a contending team, I think that's a great move and will set your team up for success down the line. All right, so there you have it. Nice to get back, on the microphone here. It's been a couple weeks, so I appreciate those of you sticking with the show. And apologies for, not having anything out. But we'll be back again next week, and we'll have another good episode cooked up as we really get into the heart of the NFL season, and we'll see how things shake out. So thank you all very much for listening. Again, this is the Dynasty War Room podcast. My name is Andrew Valancourt. Thank you all for listening.